just a brief outline. We haven't got lots of time this morning, so I'm going to keep it quite high level in terms of detail, not going into lots and lots of detail on all of these topics. But if you have got any questions, as Simon sort of alluded to, then please do shout out. Very happy for you to interrupt me as we go along. Broadly, what we're going to cover in the next sort of 40-ish minutes, the following topics. So duties and responsibilities you have as church wardens under church law. So that's under canon law. A little bit about faculties and churchyards. Very short bit on the period of transition where there's no incumbent in post. And then we're going to move on from your church law roles and have a look very briefly at your role on the PCC and being a charity trustee as a result of that. And then depending on where we get to on time, I've got a few slides on marriage, just because that's where, in terms of legal change, there has been the most movement, I guess, in the past year or so. And then just a very short bit on safeguarding, because that links to the charity trustee bit. It's not intended to talk about the Church of England role. I think there's a session on that later on. But as I said, please shout out any questions whenever you want to. So starting off with church law duties and responsibilities, we're looking here at the Church of England canons, as I mentioned, and they are pieces of law made by the Church of England, specifically Canon E, Canon E1. The canons are not all drafted in that plainer English, I would say, but they do give you a broad outline of what is expected of a church warden. And I think probably one common misconception is who church wardens sort of are ultimately responsible to. So church wardens, as you'll know, are appointed at annual meetings of the parish, but actually, legally, they're officers of the bishop. So once they're elected by the parish, actually, the parish itself has very little say in terms of how your formal appointment and if you wanted to resign, or, if something went terribly wrong, kind of a suspension, that kind of thing, that's with the bishop. The main role of church wardens is obviously to facilitate things within the parish, and within that you'd have a close working relationship with your incumbent or any other clergy that you have in the parish from time to time, and also the PCC. So I'll come on to talk about it a bit later, and we'll already be aware that you have a formal role on the PCC, but also in your capacity as a church warden, you have other roles in terms of working with the PCC, the wider PCC. You often hear the phrase being a critical friend, and really those people who are in positions as church wardens, it's sort of hoped that you will have this close working relationship with the incumbent. You'll be the person they go to for advice and support, and that goes for any other clergy you might have in the parish as well. You may be in a period of transition where you don't have an incumbent, but you're having to work with other clergy to make sure that parish life continues as close to normal as possible during that period. I've put on the slide encouraging feedback from parishioners. Obviously, that may not always be positive feedback, but really important to engage with people to ensure that you really understand the issues that may be being faced, and you can act as a line of communication to the clergy in the parish to hopefully address some of those things that are being raised. But also good to encourage positive feedback, because it's always good to have positive feedback and good news stories. It's part of the role of the church wardens to use your best endeavours, so to try as hard as possible to encourage parishioners to attend church, to promote their Christian religion and promote unity and peace. Also, you are required to assist the wider PCC in just discharging its own duty of care in respect of the church building. So it's repair and maintenance, make sure it's insured appropriately. You hold the title, so that's the legal ownership of the plate, ornaments and other movable goods that are in the church. You are required to produce an annual report on the fabric of the church and everything that belongs to the church. And to the extent you have any repairs carried out to the church, then making sure your responsibility to make sure they are included within the church logbook. You're also, in respect of the church, required to represent the parish in any faculty proceedings, which I'll talk a little bit more about in a moment. Sorry. You're also responsible for seating in the church. Now, I don't know to what extent you struggle to fill pews, chairs in your churches, but to the extent that you are in that wonderful position, then you can't prevent people from coming into the church if there aren't any seats. Just so that you're aware. Unfortunately, I'm going to assume that you may not find yourself in that position. You are also able to use reasonable force if in the event that somebody is not behaving themselves and disrupting services, or just generally acting in a disorderly way within the church or the churchyard. I've done some training with the registrar, Joss Small, recently, and his church has recently had an issue with a parishioner who unfortunately decided to take all of his clothes off in the churchyard. And so it doesn't happen very often, and I hope it doesn't happen at all to you, but in that particular case, the churchwardens did obviously have to act. They got the police involved, and it was dealt with in a kind of more formal way. But unfortunately, these things do happen from time to time, so worth knowing that in your position as churchwarden, you do have that ability to sort of step in to make sure that everything remains in line. There's a requirement for you to make sure that there's sufficient wafers and wine alternatives available at communion for everybody who is attending the service. And also your responsibility to ensure that there is the ability for offerings and collections, and also to then take responsibility for counting and logging any received during the services. And also, as part of that, to work with the incumbent, but in practice, the wider PCC, to decide how any monies received through that are spent for the benefit of the parish. So they are broadly the duties forming the role of the churchwarden that are set out in the canon. Now, by all means, have a look at the specific wording of Canon E1. But as I said, it's not in the most plain form of English. There is a book, actually, which I meant to bring down, but it's written by, it is written jointly by the Chancellor and another gentleman. So the Chancellor, Timothy Bryden, you may have come across in the context of faculty proceedings. You may not have had the pleasure yet, but he's essentially the judge of the diocese, and he, in his everyday life, is a barrister, gets involved in various matters and writes books as part of his role. He has written a quite helpful book on churchwardens and the role of the PCC, which is widely available and has recently been issued as a new edition. So I think in terms of wider reading, I would opt for something like that rather than to go to the actual law. It can be easier to digest. I'm just going to briefly talk about transition. So this is a period of time where your benefice is in vacancy. You don't have an incumbent. You may have other clergy assisting from time to time, but nobody formally appointed within the parish or benefice. So during this period, from a legal perspective, with the rural dean and anybody else appointed by the bishop, the churchwardens have the legal responsibility for maintaining the life, worship and mission of the parish. during that period, essentially just to make sure that it continues as closely to normal as possible. It's sometimes referred to, well, the legal terminology is a vacancy, so you may see that written down somewhere. The very technical term for your role in this situation is sequestrators. The Law Commission a few years ago carried out a consultation to essentially get people's views on the role and whether it was worth having any more, with a view to abolishing it, because over time the role has become very limited, and essentially it is now what I've listed on the slide. So legally speaking, control of the parsonage house within the benefice, although largely that is sort of undertaken by the DBF, who involve their agents to ensure services continue, to maintain the registers and records within the parish, and to make sure that meetings carry on. So that's really all the role boils down to now. Historically, it was much more than that, and I think over time we will see the role go together, but just to make you aware that in the period of transition, that is your legal responsibility. I'm just going to briefly talk about faculties. I don't want to cut across anything that Sue might say throughout the course of today, and if Sue thinks that I've said anything incorrect, please shout at me. So faculties are required when we're talking about doing anything within a consecrated building or churchyard. The registrar always talks about a case called Emmanuel Cheltenham, where the Chancellor of the Diocese of Gloucester, where that church sits, gave a very scathing judgment and didn't hold back on her views of the incumbent and churchwardens in that situation, where they sold a painting without getting a faculty. It was sold at auction, and because there wasn't a faculty, the person who ultimately bought it did not receive good legal title to the painting. And I think they got about over £10,000 for the painting. It wasn't an insignificant amount, but because they hadn't sold it properly, they then ended up having to go through a whole nother process, get a retrospective faculty to confirm it could be removed from the church and sold. And they ended up spending more than they made at the auction. So that's a bit of a bad news story, but the point is, before you do anything within your church or churchyard, please remember to think about the faculty process, which has been made slightly more flexible in more recent years. So you'll hear talk of List A and List B works. So anything on List A you can do without permission. List B, you will require your archdeacon's permission. And anything that doesn't fall on List A or List B will require a formal faculty. And those applications are dealt with by the Chancellor, who I mentioned earlier, in connection with the registry and Sue's team at Church House. So when we're talking about alterations to listed buildings, which you may need a faculty for, so let's say reordering, because that's significant, the test that's applied by the Chancellor is set out in a previous case called recent Altman Duffield, and essentially the Chancellor in that case was looking for the parish to answer questions around, well, how significant is the harm to the church building? You know, what special architectural or historic interest relates to this particular building? And he was looking for clear and convincing justification for the particular proposals that the parish wanted to put through. And essentially, the Chancellor wanted the parish to demonstrate the harm that was likely to arise from the proposals and whether the resulting benefit would outweigh that harm. He really also highlighted the importance of consulting and engaging with key stakeholders, with the wider community. And if your parish church does want to consider doing something that, you know, could be deemed significant or relatively significant, then we would encourage consultation before you get into the formal stages of those proposals and applying for a faculty, because you'll want, when you put in your faculty application, you'll want to understand whether there's likely to be any objection at the outset, rather than getting partway through the process and realizing that there might be more significant issues than you thought. So really important to consult and engage. Just a little bit about churchyards. So I really wanted just to highlight the existence of the churchyard regulations, which are available on the diocese website. These are regulations made by the Chancellor, and they're actually called Regulations Concerning Memorials and Headstones in Churchyards and Consecrated Burial Grounds. Snappy. But yes, as I said, available on the website. They're not particularly long. Please familiarise yourselves with them, though, because it's very important. They essentially confirm the parish's authority, the incumbent's authority, to allow certain memorials and headstones within the churchyards without having to then defer to the Chancellor to get permission for it. So very important to understand what you are allowed to permit within the churchyard. If a family came to you and wanted a memorial and it wasn't clear, or it really didn't fall within the regulations, then there would need to be a faculty application made. And again, really important to make sure that anybody that could be interested in the application is consulted. So unfortunately, we get involved in issues within the registry where we've been told that everybody with an interest has been consulted on the memorial proposals, and it turns out sometime down the line that wasn't the case. As you can imagine, it's a very sensitive, emotive issue for people. So very important, and we would encourage it, that when you're dealing with these applications on the ground, that you do ask those questions. I appreciate that's easier said than done in practice, but much rather to be upfront about these things than to find out down the line that we've got a dispute over a memorial because somebody in the family who people forgot about, or who they were purposely excluded, comes out of the woodwork and complains. It takes up a lot of time and energy from people. Sticking on the churchyards theme, just to mention burial very briefly. So a person has a legal right to be buried in a parish if they live or they die in the parish. It is also possible, in principle, for somebody to make a reservation of space in the churchyard. That's subject to PCC policies being in place. Your PCC may have developed a policy around grave space reservations and the extent to which you permit those within your particular parish. Now, I've just referenced closed churchyards on this slide. Churchyards are only legally closed if they have been closed by what's called an order in council. And these order in councils will confirm it's closed and no further burials are permitted, but it may set out some specific exceptions. So, for example, you may still be able to inter ashes in a garden of remembrance. That may be set out in the order itself. If you have a closed churchyard, it's very important to understand what those conditions are. We have a lot of queries in the registry around churchyards which either people are not sure whether they have been formally closed or not, and if they have potential issues with continued burials or interment of ashes where they shouldn't have been interred. So just encouraging you, where you're in a parish and there is a closed churchyard, or you think there might be a closed churchyard, just to make sure that you understand what the conditions are around those. If you want to ask any questions around closed churchyards, then please do come to the registry, because we can get hold of orders in council for you. And I would recommend, if you do have a churchyard that's closed in your parish, that a copy of the order in council that's relevant to it is kept very clearly amongst the parish records, so that your successors can understand the arrangements that are in place and what is permitted and what's not permitted in future. Once a churchyard is formally closed, it is possible to pass on liability for maintenance to the parish council. Could talk a long time about this subject, and the extent to which parish councils can assist Church of England churches, but we could be here all day. It's all very much up in the air at the moment, and the registry will be doing an article on that in the next newsletter, which we issue from time to time. Finally, just on this topic, just to mention exhumations. When somebody is buried within the churchyard, if that is with the intention that that is where they will remain. So if for whatever reason a family member wants to move them, for example, there may be a specific reason for that. That will need specific permission. As I said, the presumption is they will remain where they are, where they're buried, or where their ashes are interred. So that will need very specific application to the Chancellor around that. I'm just going to pause there just to ask if anybody's got any questions on that particular section.
Yeah, I have. We've got a closed churchyard, and the agreement was made years ago that the local council would maintain it, but they are in financial difficulties, so they do not. Does that then come back to the churchwarden?
Strictly speaking, not, because the liability does legally transfer. But when I just mentioned issues with parish councils, that was what I was sort of alluding to, because we are finding that there are lots of parishes in a similar situation to you, in that the liability has been formally transferred, but actually for one reason or another, the parish council isn't able to actually fulfill that role. I think that there is you end up in a bit of a quandary, because obviously if there are sort of health and safety type issues as a result of the failings of the parish council to be able to meet their maintenance liability, and the church could afford to step in, then I think that, you know, to save any issues potentially, then it would be the right and the reasonable thing to do to make sure, you know, if it is a health and safety issue, that something is made safe to allow people to still come to the church and the churchyard. That's a very broad comment, and you know, we could sit there and unpick it, but I think if you knew there was an issue and you knew that the parish council couldn't provide you with the funding, then I don't think it would necessarily be then reasonable to just sit back and leave it because the parish council should be funding it. I think if there is anything specific like that and you're not sure, then either I'm going to say Sue Thorold's team may be able to help. She is nodding, I think, or come to the registry with your specific circumstances, and we could give you a steer on how to approach that. Sue, did you want to add anything to that?
Only to say that most of there are some parish councils look after churchyards in our diocese, but most of them seem to be Cornwall Council have taken them on, and there's specific areas of Cornwall Council that deal with wherever your churchyard has to be. I know that it is an issue because Cornwall Council, when I first started, sort of nearly 12 years ago, had about 80 churchyards that they were required to maintain. And now that is way over 100, you know, so it's increased sort of almost 50% since I started. So, you know, it's an understandable financial burden to the council, and you know, but they are pretty amenable. And there's a couple of churches here that I know in my husband's parishes that this has happened to, and there are ways of dealing with it. I mean, if you speak to the relevant council area, then they will often try to help out. Another option is the prison service. We've got one or two churches here where the prison, you know, where people are on probationary service, come out and help in the churchyards and do a cracking job, I have to say. In fact, you know, that they're more thorough than the council can be, because all they are required to do is probably up to 3 cuts a year, and that isn't always happening. So yeah, so it's talk to me, I can direct you to the right person, or talk to the relevant council area or whoever maintains your churchyard.
Well, so I have to say, the community payback are fantastic. And they enjoy coming and doing the work as well. So I would recommend them.
Yep.
Thanks, Sue. Yeah, as I said, we're going to be doing a bit more on the role of local authorities, so including parish councils, and the Church of England in our next newsletter, because it is quite a hot topic at the moment, and we are seeing, as I'm sure Sue is, lots of parishes who are having trouble on the funding aspects to make sure things are properly maintained, because the last thing you want to happen, as I sort of alluding to, is for there to be an issue with it from a health and safety perspective for anybody. Brilliant. Are there any more questions on that?
Yes, please, Laura. You mentioned a logbook. I have no logbook. I don't know that my predecessors had a logbook. What form should that take, please?
Well, I would like to open the question to the floor, because my understanding is you could probably buy something which specifically has logbook on it online and pay lots of money for it. But I think the basics of it are to note what happened in the church and the dates around it, and any relevant documents that relate to it. So, for example, if you had some work done to the roof and it was guaranteed, then you could make reference to that within the logbook. Again, it's kind of helpful for your successors as well as for you at the time that you're in post. But Sue, did you want to add anything?
Yeah, I do. Greg, I've got a template I can send you, so I'll ping that across to you.
Thanks a lot, Sue. Yeah, I thank Laura. Thank you.
Sue, could you ping me one as well, please?
Yeah, of course.
Thank you.
So, story from the land. Due to circumstances in recent years, I've been assistant church warden, but I was assisting myself because we had no church warden. I'm very much on the starting blocks, and I haven't even located the logbook, and I don't think it could have been looked at for about 4 or 5 years. I'll sort things out.
I'm in about the same situation, Doreen, don't worry. I haven't even got a terrier at the moment. I've got to start a whole brand new one. So.
Oh, so have I.
Yes.
Kate's just helpfully put the link to the logbook in the chat if anybody wants it. So there you go. No need to have a fancy hard book register. Thank you, Sue and Kate. Any other questions?
Yes, please. It's Julie here from Menhenia.
Hello, Julie.
Hi. Just going back to the closing the churchyard. Sue said that it does actually go to Cornwall Council now to look after.
No, sorry, Julie. No, not necessarily.
No,
just,
okay.
Yeah.
That's what I wanted to clarify, because everybody's saying to me it goes to Cornwall Council, and then I've obviously just heard that it's the parish council. So I just wanted to find out.
It can be either, it can be either, and have I sent you? Have you asked for the closure I've got a really useful document on it, and I can send you that.
One of the other members was looking of the PCC was looking into it. We've got, you know, a churchyard person, so they were looking into it. We haven't made any decision yet, so I was just, you know, now I'd heard that.
Yeah.
You know,
I've got some very good guidance that doesn't tie you to anything, but just gives you the overview of what you need to do. So
if you could
I'll send you
that would be great. Thanks, Sue. Yeah. I just want them all to be aware as to what could happen, because I know relations with the PC aren't great. So, and also, what would be if whoever it passes to, whether it's Cornwall Council or the parish council, what are their legal entitlements to that land then? I mean, could they, you know, rock up and do whatever they like in there, or you know, do they have title to it? What actually happens?
No, so nothing actually changes from a legal ownership perspective. That will remain the same. It is just the maintenance liability that will pass, and that is only if the PCC take a formal decision to do that. So I have to admit, I haven't seen Sue's pack, but I'm going to assume it specifically talks about the PCC actually having to make a proactive decision to ask to transfer the maintenance liability to the local authority, whatever the local authority in your context will look like, the parish council or Cornwall Council. So the churchyard will remain vested in the incumbent of your particular benefice.
Okay. Yeah, so all they get to do is look after it, not actually do anything else with it, or yeah. Okay, thank you.
Brilliant. Am I okay to move on? Are there any other questions? Right, I am conscious of time because I don't want to get the day off to overrun on the not so interesting legal aspects. I would only briefly mention your role as churchwardens in connection with the PCC. So once you're elected as churchwardens, you become an ex officio member of the PCC, so a member by virtue of that role. Being a member of the PCC means that under charity law, you will be charity trustees, like all the other members of the PCC. The reason that PCCs are charities is because under charity law, there are various what we call heads of description of charity, and PCC's purposes, the reason why they exist, fall within those. So essentially to advance the Christian religion within the parish, that is a charitable purpose. So charity law applies. With that brings with it some more duties and responsibilities, you'll be pleased to know. I've kind of very briefly described the main ones on the slide. So to act solely and exclusively in the interests of the PCC at all times, act with reasonable care and skill, protect the PCC's assets and manage its resources responsibly, manage conflicts of interest, and be accountable. And that's to your parishioners, to the diocese more widely, to the public more widely. If you haven't already done so, I would encourage you to have a look at the Charity Commission's guidance, which is their publication CC3, The Essential Trustee, What You Need to Know, What You Need to Do. It's available through their website. It's very accessible, easily understandable, and it just goes through in more detail the key duties and responsibilities of charity trustees, and they are exactly the same as any other charity trustee. There's nothing specific under charity law for PCCs. The one thing I will mention that is specific to PCCs is a requirement to register with the Charity Commission. So for PCCs, you're only required to register if your annual income is over £100,000. There are some PCCs that find themselves in a position where they do need to register. If you don't, because your income is lower than that, then you are still a charity and you are still regulated by the Charity Commission. So just to bear that in mind. There's lots of other guidance available on the Charity Commission's website, free of charge as well. And I would encourage you to have a look at that and share that with your PCCs. It's also possible to sign up for alerts with the Charity Commission as well, which sort of tell you when the Charity Commission releases new guidance, updated guidance, other things happening with the Commission and in the sector. And you can do that through the Commission's website as well. So where, in terms of under the church representation rules, so back to talking about church law, so every PCC has a standing committee where your parish roll is less than 50, church wardens are automatically members of the standing committee. If you have a larger role, so over 50, then your church wardens can be appointed to go onto the standing committee, but they're not automatically members. Makes sense? And also the other key one to flag is if you don't have a treasurer in post, then and you as in there's no member of the PCC who's taken on that role, and you choose not to appoint somebody else outside of the church, then it's for the church warden to make sure that that role is covered for the PCC. I've just referenced delegation of functions on the slide, and that's just simply to say that it is possible for you to delegate to involve other people. That may mean appointing formally deputy church wardens. So if you have more than one church within your parish, then it may be that you have other people appointed as church wardens, and specifically as deputy church wardens. If within your parish you formally appoint deputy church wardens, then they will also automatically be members of the PCC. But if you're just asking other people from time to time to help you fulfill your role, then they will not be, legally speaking, deputy church wardens. So they won't also be PCC members. But I just wanted to make the point that it is fine for you to get other people to help you fulfill your role if that would be helpful.
Can that be somebody who are not members of the church? Can it be an outsider?
If they're just helping you with your role, and there's no, on an ad hoc basis, and there's no intention for them to be a formal legal deputy church warden, then yes, provided they're somebody who you reasonably think is appropriate to help you with whatever it is.
The best thing I've heard all morning. Thank you.
But bear in mind when you're doing that you as the church warden will remain ultimately responsible to make sure that the roles are fulfilled and discharged properly. But yes, if you've got, family member that wants to help you out one morning, then no reason why not, provided that you're happy they're doing it properly. Yes, just finally on this aspect, I wanted to mention what I've called ecclesiastical and parochial charities. So quite often you find that kind of very small trusts that are linked to parishes, and that the vicar and church wardens, or the rector and church wardens, however the governing document for these trusts are drafted, will automatically be the charity trustees of these trusts. It's really worth spending some time understanding if there are any of these trusts that are connected with the parish in any way, because you will then have duties and responsibilities in relation to those trusts as well. And in this context, it's also very important to remember the point I made on the previous slide about managing conflicts of interest, because the little trusts that you might find yourself also being charity trustees of may have slightly different purposes and aims to the wider PCC. So it's just making sure that you are acting appropriately when you're considering these other trusts and not the PCC as a whole. I have a few slides about marriage, and I really just wanted to mention marriage because there have been some changes here recently. I don't really have a lot of time to talk about it, but I just wanted to highlight that earlier this year the legal age of marriage was raised to 18. It was previously 16, it is now 18. The Law Commission has recently carried out a consultation on marriage within the Church of England, but also generally, and that's currently with the government. So I suspect their focus is elsewhere currently, but at some point in the future, we would expect there to be what could be some quite significant changes to marriage law. But for now, it remains the same. And I would just urge you to kind of, to the extent you're involved within couples marrying within your parishes, to just be mindful of the nationality requirement. I think out of all of this, that's the one thing I'll just highlight now. So as a result of Brexit, there were some changes to the marriage legislation and the immigration legislation. And so people who we're talking about what is referred to as relevant nationals and non-relevant nationals. So when we're talking about relevant nationals, that's anyone who is British, Irish, or has settled or pre-settled status under the European Union settlement scheme. When somebody comes to you and says, oh, we'd like to get married in your church, please, well, they may be obvious to you that they are British nationals, for example, but I would really encourage you to still ask that question. And obviously, from a legal perspective, there is a requirement to request identification documentation, and within that to confirm nationality. So even if you think you know, you should still be asking the question about somebody's nationality. If you have somebody coming to you that isn't British, so they don't hold a British passport or an Irish passport, but say we had somebody recently who was Spanish, and there was a question there about how they can get married in church. The key question you'll need to ask is, do you have settled or pre-settled status? And they should be able to demonstrate that to you by giving you access to part of the government website, which will show you a picture of them and confirm their status and any other kind of relevant immigration points. And that is through what's called a share code. It's really important that you check that, because if you find you have a relevant national, so a British person, an Irish person, or someone with settled or pre-settled status, they can get married in church following ecclesiastical preliminaries. So banns, they can have their banns read still, or say the couple don't live in England, or there's not enough time for banns, then they can get married by common license. If you have somebody who is not British, not Irish, does not have settled or pre-settled status, they can get married in church, but they can only follow civil preliminaries. So what's now called a marriage schedule, and they will need to go off to Cornwall Council to arrange that. So provided whoever the couple want to marry them in church, provided they're happy to do so, then they go off to the council and get their marriage schedule. There have also been changes to registration recently. So churches maybe no longer hold marriage register books or issue marriage certificates after the service. Instead, where somebody's marrying by banns, there's a requirement to produce a marriage document, and that effectively replicates what used to be in the marriage register. And a copy of that gets signed in the way that the register books would historically have been signed, and then that needs to be sent off to your local registration service, and they register the marriage and they issue the certificate to the couple. I think that's one point that sometimes gets misunderstood by couples, and I would, to the extent you are involved in marriages within your parish and organising them, I think it's just really important to highlight to them that after the service, they need to get in touch with the local registration office to get hold of their certificate, rather than expect the church to do that, because that is not something churches do anymore. The last 3 minutes, I'm just going to mention one point on safeguarding, which links to your roles as charity trustees. I'm not going to go into any detail on the Church of England safeguarding aspects. Essentially, the Charity Commission's view on safeguarding is very wide. I've just included a quote from the Charity Commission's guidance, but it effectively, from the Commission's perspective, they believe their view is that charity trustees have a duty to protect anybody at all that comes into contact with the charity. So in your case, into contact with the PCC. Historically, we've just talked about children and vulnerable adults, now known as adults at risk. But from the Commission's perspective, it is a lot wider than that. So I just wanted to highlight that and the requirement for the PCC and its members to make sure that, as well as complying with the Church of England specific requirements, you will need to comply with the Charity Commission's own guidance on safeguarding as well. Yes, I think. So the last slide was just to pick up on some practical tips, but I think you've got lots of resources available to you at Church House. Sue Thorold has alluded to those already. We're very happy to help at the registry, and our contact details are on the next slide if you don't already have them. And there's lots of free information available online on Parish Resources website, on the Charity Commission website. So please do have a look at that. And importantly, attending training sessions that that Arsis has put on today. Really, really helpful for you to just get a general overview of your role and all of the things that you need to keep on top of. So I have skipped over a little bit, but if there's any questions on the marriage section on the slides, anybody would particularly like a further explanation of, then I'm very happy to do that separately if you want to send me an email or something. So here we are. I've included the registrar as well, in case you'd like to see him this morning, and there are direct contact details, but we do also have a general registry email address as well, which is shroregistry@vwv.co.uk.